The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas, critical opinions in Southeast Asia. Hey, this is Arlene.
Hi, this is Gowri.
We are back with our Durian Heat, our second segment of today. We have a guest all the way from the US. His name is Jerry Overton. He's the part of the International Academies of Emergency Dispatch, and he's the chairman of the group itself. Hi.
Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you? What's the time now there?
I'm good. Actually, as we speak, I'm in England, so it's early morning here also on the 29th.
Oh, it's in England. Anyway, today's topic is about disaster response. How we can talk about more about how to prepare ourselves during times of crisis or times of disaster. Perhaps a bit of introduction of yourself and the upcoming event called Asia Navigator.
Yes, that'll be fine. A little introduction about myself. I have been the chief executive of two different emergency medical services in the United States, one in Richmond, Virginia, and the other one in Kansas City, Missouri, and I currently serve as the chair of the International Academies of Emergency Dispatch. Realizing how important dispatch was in the process, I thought that it was an opportunity to become much, much more involved in what we consider to be the first link in the chain of survival. And that's what I'm doing now. We have a very important upcoming event in Kuala Lumpur. It's called our Asia Navigator, and this is our third year of having an Asia Navigator in Kuala Lumpur.
The third year.
The Navigator itself is the premier dispatch education event in all of Asia. Mm-hmm. It's an opportunity for not only dispatchers to learn, but also those involved in police, fire, and emergency medical services to learn the importance of dispatch and different components of dispatch.
How did you get involved with this whole emergency rescue and dispatch?
Well, dispatch, there's a concept called the chain of survival, mm-hmm. and it all begins with dispatch. We recognize that early access is key if anybody who is suffering a life-threatening event has a chance of survival. And so the reason I got involved in dispatch is because of the fact that my systems in Richmond and Kansas City, we place such a heavy emphasis on making sure that we got the right resource to the right event at the right time so that we had that opportunity to save a life.
Mm-hmm. So, for you yourself, how did you get involved in this particular line, and how did you manage to be part of this whole institute of academy?
Me myself, well, that goes back many, many, many years, Arlene. Way before too many years to really talk about. But I've always had an interest in emergency services. And there was a person in Kansas City from where I was from that had a very serious event, and no ambulance came. Mm-hmm. And so I thought this would be something very interesting, and so I got involved in that. And then just one thing led to another, and here I am today.
So why is it important that you hold this event in KL, or why did you choose KL?
Because Kuala Lumpur has always been a leader in emergency medical services for all of Southeast Asia. The hospital of Kuala Lumpur provides a very high-quality service with some extremely good leadership. They actually were the first dispatch center in Asia to implement what we call a priority dispatch process or a call triage process. And because of their commitment to quality at Hospital Kuala Lumpur, we decided that this was the best place to hold this event. And since our first Navigator, it continues to grow. So we're always happy to come back. I guess that would be one reason. Of course, the second reason is that Kuala Lumpur is such a lovely city, and the people are absolutely marvelous. I mean, the people are absolutely marvelous in Kuala Lumpur. And so we just enjoy our time there.
So you have been expanding, for the Asia Navigator from just Malaysia to Southeast Asia and also now Asia.
That's correct. Then we have different dispatch. Our dispatch protocol, the Academies dispatch protocol, is actually in about 44 different countries at this point across the world. And so, in Southeast Asia, not only in Kuala Lumpur do we have the emergency medical services dispatch, we also have the fire protocol. Again, Malaysia's always been a leader as far as public safety is concerned, and this is why we enjoy returning to Malaysia. Mm-hmm. But we also have the protocol in other places. In fact, we have it all over Australia.
Mm-hmm. So, what kind of emergency dispatch that you focus on? Because I think there are a lot of different areas to be explored.
Well, emergency dispatch has actually in the past not had the emphasis that it should have had. When we think of public safety, we always think of what happens at the scene, whether it be police coming to take care of a person or try to prevent a crime, or whether it be fire departments trying to put out a fire, or ambulance trying to save a life. But what's not happened is in fact that we look at dispatch as a profession and how important it is. And so that's why we place the emphasis on dispatch, that we're placing the emphasis on dispatch for this particular meeting.
Mm-hmm. For you yourself, what do you see the difference between disaster response or the emergency response in Asia compared to in the US or in Europe?
Well, every place is different, and I think that's an important thing to start with as far as emergency response and disaster response. There's not one system that's better than another. They're just different because of the way their histories have been, the way they culturally have evolved. And so, really, though, when you start looking at disaster response, and in fact, I think in many ways the disaster response in Southeast Asia is ahead of where we are in North America because of the fact that it seems like anymore there's so many disasters in Southeast Asia. If you look at the number of cyclones recently that have hit the Philippines or Australia, when you look at those types of disasters, it seems like the preparation has become more and more sophisticated.
Mm-hmm. Can you share more how countries in Southeast Asia prepare for this kind of disaster? Because I think in Malaysia in particular, early this year, we were hit by a major flood that was one of the worst in Malaysia's history. And a lot of public were complaining that the government were a bit slow in terms of responding to the needs of the local community on the ground. But on the other hand, you mentioned that there a lot more progress that has been achieved in Southeast Asia in terms of responding to natural disaster, for example. Perhaps you can share more about what the government has done, or at least some of the people that were part of your conferences have shared their best practices.
Well, first off, I've had the privilege of personally working with Dr. Abu Hassan at a hospital Kuala Lumpur, who is a recognized international expert in emergency medical services and disaster response. But I think your question is incredibly important, Arlene, incredibly important, because to prepare for a disaster response, we have to make sure we're prepared for every single response of every single day. Because if we can't respond to a person's heart attack, or if we can't respond to a person who's in a severe car wreck, there's really no way any EMS system or any public safety system can respond to a disaster. So we have to be prepared every single day for every single event. And then when there is a bigger event, then in fact we're much more prepared because we have that professionalism, and that's exactly where we are, whether it be in the United States or in Malaysia. I know that the public gets very impatient during a disaster response. When I was the chief executive of the Richmond Ambulance Authority, we had a huge hurricane come through Richmond, Virginia. And we were without power for over 2 weeks. And that's in my city in Richmond, we were without water for a week. And people became very, very, very impatient because of the infrastructure that was damaged. But what the citizens have to understand that there's something called surge capacity. And we have to try and meet that surge capacity every single day. And when we have an extraordinary event, that surge capacity is exceeded. And no system in the world can immediately respond to disaster when they're above that surge capacity. So I understand the concerns of the citizens. My citizens in Richmond had the same concerns. But it just takes time to be able to handle a major event and then recover from that major event.
Mm-hmm. We will share more on how to address major events like this, and what are the procedures that usually would entail when people are faced with this kind of disasters and other emergency issues. So we'll take a short break. When we return, we will talk more with Jerry.
The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas, critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hey, this is Arlene.
Hi, this is Gowri.
And we are back again with Jerry Overton of the International Academies of Emergency Dispatch, IAED, and he's the chair of that academy. And we, as usual, we are talking about Asia Navigator, an upcoming event which would address emergency dispatch and also towards a more effective disaster response. So, in continuing our discussion today, Jerry. Hi.
Yes.
In continuing our discussion today, when it comes to disaster response, what is the right way to respond to a disaster when it comes to professional response and trying to be more effective at addressing certain key crises during emergency?
Well, there's no one right answer to that because of the fact that, each disaster is different. A fire disaster is going to be different than a flood disaster, or a natural disaster could be different than a terrorist situation. So, really, when we start talking about a disaster response, we have to be ready for just about anything. And it kind of goes to what you just said, Arlene. We have to be prepared. And I think that's the most important thing. And being prepared means, as you just said, being professional. And it just and today, fortunately, very fortunately, like the fire departments in Malaysia, the ambulance services in Malaysia are in fact professional and handle everyday events very, very well. And that helps lead into when there is a major event that requires all the different facets to come together. I think the other thing that is regarding a disaster is that all the services have to work together. In other words, that's unlike a situation or a daily event like a cardiac arrest. When you have a terrorist event or when you have a major flood, the fact of the matter is all services have to work because all services have a very specific role in that event.
And what are some of the challenges that can face you or the team when you're responding to these emergencies?
Well, if we're talking about what's the pressures on an everyday emergency, probably one of the biggest pressures on everyday emergencies is, in fact, something that most people don't recognize. And that is right now the pressures are systems are getting busier and busier and busier and busier. In fact, in Malaysia, you're seeing about a 10 to 12 to 15% increase in just demand for patients calling your emergency number every year. So every year you're getting a 15% increase in demand on just ambulance services. And those are pressures that people actually don't see. The other pressure is that not only is that growth happening, but, in many systems, including those in Malaysia, there's many, many people calling for prank calls.
Mm-hmm.
And, people call for prank calls. There's a high percentage of prank calls in Kuala Lumpur, and those need not to happen. People need to understand that this is an emergency service. Don't call unless you really have a true emergency. And that way, the responders have the opportunity to provide you with a life-threatening response and not be out on a needless call. So those are pressures that happen every single hour of every single day. And if you can help alleviate those pressures, then when a disaster happens, you've got more resources and more preparation to be able to respond to not only the life-threatening emergencies on a daily basis, but also the disaster situations.
And what about the basic procedures that you need during emergency call and also crisis situation?
That is a very important question. That is an incredibly important question, Arlene, and I really appreciate you asking that, because what the caller doesn't quite understand is that in Malaysia, there is a evidence-based protocol that dispatchers use to take the call. And those questions are structured in such a way to identify the worst cases first. And so people shouldn't get excited or think that the dispatcher is taking too much time, because the dispatcher isn't. What the dispatcher is doing is asking very specific questions to identify what is exactly wrong with that person, and also be able to provide that person with instructions on how to help the patient until the ambulance arrives. For instance, the dispatchers are highly trained in providing cardiac arrest or CPR instruction over the telephone. They're highly trained to do that and help save a life. They're also very highly trained to deliver a baby over the telephone. In my system in Richmond, or your system in Kuala Lumpur, the International Academy of Emergency Dispatch has a very specific protocol on delivering on childbirth. So people shouldn't think the dispatchers are taking too much time. What they should understand is there's a specific reason for every question, and those questions can lead to the dispatcher providing instructions that will save a life.
Oh, let's talk about when during disaster time, because I think Southeast Asia is quite prone to natural disaster. As you mentioned earlier, in the Philippines, they just overcame a typhoon, and also in Malaysia with floods and all that. During a disaster like unforeseen disaster like typhoon or floods or even tsunami, what usually would the fire, the policemen, and also the medical care personnel would do in terms of addressing the immediate emergency response?
Well, all three of those services that you just talked about, their primary mission is always to save a life and to protect the public. And minimize the harm to the public. So whether we're talking about police, fire, or emergency medical services, that is their primary mission. I mean, whether it's crowd control or traffic control for the police department, whether it's heavy rescue for fire, in drowning situations or in a tsunami situation, or whether it's, providing medical care, each one of those services are called public safety, and it's public safety for a reason, because they're all dedicated, they're highly dedicated public servants that are there to save property and lives.
Mm-hmm. For such a disaster where the scale is pretty large, usually how would they expand in terms of their personnel, their facilities and all that? Would they have a good database to contact people outside of either their district or their country, or even trying to have collaboration with the global emergency personnel?
And another good question, another excellent question. Disasters know no bounds. When we had the hurricane in Richmond, I had providers, I had help from other states. Besides Virginia. And when you have disasters in Southeast Asia, it's very common for other countries to come to the aid of the country in trouble. So if you think back to the tsunami in Indonesia, for instance, the tragic tsunami that killed so many thousands of lives, that was a global response to that disaster. So when, in the same way when when the situation in Haiti happened, another global response. So it depends upon the magnitude of the disaster. The magnitude of the disaster is going to determine, the type of response, whether it be simply local, whether countrywide, or whether it's will involve multiple jurisdictions and multiple countries.
Mm-hmm. But in Southeast Asia, if you can share with us, what are the challenges that countries within this region are facing that either the government or the individual sectors in the fire, police, and medical should address?
Well, again, I think the biggest factors are simply the factors of that disasters are unfortunately becoming more and more common.
Especially with climate change on the rise.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry?
Especially with climate change on the rise, and also when growth has over skyrocketed in a lot of the areas within Southeast Asia, economic growth.
Exactly right. Climate change is providing us, unfortunately, with more and more natural disasters, and that's what we're seeing. And so, it's a situation where we have to recognize that we're going to be more and more challenged because of these types of situations, and that's why it's so important for us, like at the International Academies of Emergency Dispatch, to have our protocol there, because that protocol helps triage the more serious situations, so that in a disaster we know, and we can, the governments will know exactly what resources to send to their different events.
But what can the government or the individual sectors that are involved do to have a more effective disaster response or emergency response as well?
Well, I think probably one of the biggest things is planning. There's a lot of that going on, but I think planning is one key. The second key is having different agencies work together on a relatively regular basis, so that the police or law enforcement and the fire and EMS actually know each other, mm-hmm. so that they know how to respond, so that they have what's called an incident command system, best practice, so that when a disaster happens, not only is there a professional relationship, but a personal relationship, and the different agencies know how the other agency is going to react, and what resources they're going to have. So I think planning, having constant communication, both formal communication and informal communication, are two things that can play a key role in ensuring that you've got that successful response in the first few hours.
Mm-hmm. When you say planning, can you explain in detail, like, what are the areas that they need to focus more on?
Well, I think, when we start talking about planning, again, it's got to be more generalized, because while there's been more, when we talk about planning, what resources are generally available, ensuring that you've got a technical communication system that's set up, that's going to withstand some type of a natural or a man-made event, so that you look at the infrastructure that you have and how the different agencies' infrastructures can have what we call interoperability, so that they can actually interact or intermesh with each other. That's all part of the plan, so that when something happens, all that comes together very quickly and seamlessly to ensure that response. So when we talk about plan, a lot of people think, oh, can't we plan for a flood, or can't we plan for a cyclone, or can't we plan for a terrorist event? But the problem is, you never know exactly what the next disaster will be. It's maybe something you will never suspect happening. You could plan, for instance, for a cyclone, and the next disaster might be a train crash that involves hazardous materials that down in, right in the middle of Kuala Lumpur, because, the trains run right through Kuala Lumpur. That's maybe something you would never plan, you would never even think about. But you can't plan for a specific event. What you can plan for is a generalized response where the agencies ensure that they're working together.
Mm-hmm. Earlier on, you mentioned something about terrorism, and as we all know, in Southeast Asia, one of the key focus among ASEAN ministers right now is to fight or to combat terrorism. Can you share some of the key basic procedures or basic idea about how would police or even military or security personnel do in times of a terrorist attack?
Well, again, I'm not specific to law enforcement, so I can't actually address your question from a law enforcement perspective. But what I can share with you is, for instance, when the Twin Towers were hit by the terrorists in New York City, again, the New York City Fire Department and New York City Police Department worked very closely together because they had worked together in the past to be able to respond to that. Each one knew its specific role and how those two roles were going to intermesh. So again, not specific to terrorists that had they practiced, but they knew how they were going to respond. So from my perspective, when you face an event, you face an event, you face an event. Mm-hmm. And regardless of, it's the same way with London Ambulance. When London Ambulance faced the bombings that happened in their subway system, they did an outstanding job because they had faced disasters before, not that particular type of terrorist event, but they knew how to respond and knew how to go into those subways and get patients.
Anyway, we'll take another short break. When we return, we'll talk more about the upcoming event, Asia Navigator.
The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas, critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene. We are back again.
Hi, this is Gowri.
And of course, you are with us at the Durian Heat, where we discuss really critical issue in Southeast Asia. And today, of course, continuing our discussion on Asia Navigator, which is an upcoming event on disaster response and emergency dispatch. We have Jerry Overton as part of the International Academies of Emergency Dispatch here with us. I have a question regarding on people's expectation. We discussed earlier about in terms of natural disaster, people usually get very impatient. They were not usually they would criticize the government for not being quick enough or effective enough in responding in natural disaster. But perhaps you can share with us what is the reality on the ground when things like this happen, and what usually would the fire, the police, and also the medical care sector would do to address this issue? Are they being ineffective, or the reality is actually much of a different tone than that?
Well, I think, it's interesting. It's a really interesting question, and one that's a very complex question, Arlene, because I think reality, I'm sorry, I got some background noise here, but I think reality never meets expectations. I mean, if you think about the fact that when you just have, sorry, there's very noisy here. If you think about the fact that when, even in a daily situation where somebody's hurt or somebody's had a car wreck, and you want a very quick response, and the response doesn't come that quickly, well, people will think, oh my gosh, that ambulance took 15 or 20 minutes to get here, where the reality of a situation may be that it only took 6 to 8 minutes. Now, let's take that situation and extrapolate it to a disaster. And in my own personal situation in Richmond, when we lost water, and the water went out in the city of Richmond for about a week, I couldn't, I was frustrated because I wanted to have water. And I couldn't understand, and I mean, I was right in the middle of it, working it, and still couldn't understand why we couldn't get water back. So, and I knew why we couldn't get water back, and I was frustrated, because the power plant that supplied the water purification plant, the power plant were next to each other, and both of them went down at the same time. So my point is that I understand why people get frustrated. I've been there. I know. But I think that, there are certain foundations that are being laid in a disaster that the public doesn't see to be able to get basic services back going. And it just simply takes time. And so, yes, governments do get criticized in those situations. I've been criticized personally in those situations because my ambulances haven't been fast enough. But the fact of the matter is, you have to understand that when these situations occur, you are overwhelmed. You can never plan. I mean, you can plan, but the fact of the matter is, you are simply overwhelmed. I repeat that. And because you just don't have that many resources available to be able to respond to a disaster and continue to respond to everyday events. So I think, maybe an education process would help simply because, as you mentioned before the break, climate change is happening. We are seeing more disasters. And I think educating the public that there may be more disasters and what the limitations or what the opportunities are for response might be a help. But unfortunately, as you indicate, Arlene, I mean, there's a difference between realities and expectations, and I wish we could always meet the expectations, but unfortunately, that's just not reality.
I see. So let's talk about the Asia Navigator. Can you share with us more about the event and how people can participate in it?
Okay, Asia Navigator is going to be coming up in this March, and it is designed to bring together public safety officials, not only dispatchers, but it's also designed for those who are involved in any type of public safety field, whether it be a government official or police, fire, civil defense. And the curriculum or the program is varied. There definitely will be programs oriented as far as disaster is concerned. We have an expert coming from Queensland, Australia, who went through the typhoon in Australia. We have another coming from the Philippines after that recent event. Not only do we have that, but we also have every day, we have topics focused on what happens every day. I myself am giving the leading keynote on what we call dispatch and how it impacts the patient journey from the time a person has an emergency to the time the person receives some type of definitive care at the hospital, and all the different parts that a person or a system goes through, and how we can maximize the impact for the patient or make sure that patient gets better care. Mm. So, and then there's another session on incident command, what we were talking about before the break, how we can communicate better in cases of a disaster between police, fire, and EMS. So there's a varied number of, there's a lot of different topics that's going to be very interesting to those involved in public safety.
Mm-hmm. And what's the aim of this year's conference compared to last few years?
Well, I think the aim of all of our Navigator conferences is we call it the premier conference for public safety dispatch. And the aim of all of our conferences is to raise the professionalism of dispatch and to introduce new topics to dispatch, provide better education for those involved in dispatch and communication center, and ensure that we are working together. So each one of the navigators, we not only do we have one in Asia, next week we have one in the Middle East. I'll be in Doha, Qatar the next week. And then in February we have one in Ireland. Mm. So we really believe at the Academies that dispatch is the most important component in the chain of survival. We have a saying, if it doesn't go right at dispatch, it probably isn't going to go right when you have an emergency. And we at the Academies are committed and dedicated to making sure that that it's going to go right.
Mm-hmm. So in Malaysia, what were the feedback in the previous conferences?
Well, the feedback's been excellent in Malaysia, simply because of the fact that is one of our biggest navigators. We have We have more attendance in Malaysia than we do at our other navigators, which I think shows the extremely high level of interest in Malaysia and Southeast Asia for the professionalism of dispatch and what we at the Academies are trying to achieve in providing an evidence-based program.
So how can people get more information about this? Let's say they are not part of the government, but they still want to attend this event to get basic knowledge about how they can do better emergency response.
We have a website, I think, and the website is they can Google the International Academies of Emergency Dispatch, and or I'll give you the website www.emergencydispatch.org. That's www.emergencydispatch.org. And if they go to that website, not only will they learn about navigators, they'll learn about the International Academy of Dispatch. They'll learn about what it means to have protocols in a dispatch center, call triage, and, as I mentioned earlier, what we call life-saving instructions that the dispatchers give. So there are all kinds of different information at our website at www.emergencydispatch.org, which is the website for the International Academies of Emergency Dispatch.
Mm-hmm. With that, thank you very much. Thank you for sharing your views, as well as we hope that all the best for Asia Navigator 2015 in Kuala Lumpur.
Arlene, it's been a real privilege being on with you this morning. Thank you ever so much for having me.
Thank you.